Good evening, everyone, to whoever has joined us. So we are waiting for a few more people to join, and we should begin in maybe 5 minutes. Good evening, Dr. Stevens.
Hey, Pinky, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now. Can you hear me?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can anyone else hear me?
Yes, Pinky, Dr. Stevens, you both are audible.
All right. Should we start?
Let's get started, Pinky.
All right. Okay. I'll just share screens. Okay, hi. Welcome to everyone who is joining us today. We are really pleased to have Dr. Ashley Stevens join us for another event. And today he will be talking on socially responsible licensing of drugs and vaccines and the surprising role of public sector R&D in the discovery of drugs. So I'll briefly give an introduction to Venture Center and TechX, after which I'll introduce Dr. Ashley Stevens, and then he will begin his talk. So Venture Center is a Section 8 not-for-profit. We are hosted by CSIR National Chemical Laboratory, and we are located in Pune. We are approved by BIRAC and recognized by DSIR and DIPP. And we have won many awards in the last few years in recognition of our
Pinky,
services.
sorry to interrupt you. I think Dr. Stevens is unable to hear anything. Dr. Stevens? He has put a message in chat box. Dr. Stevens, can you hear us?
Okay.
Uh,
Let's see what can be done.
Should I
Is his laptop on mute? Like setting how? Like I'll just type.
can everyone else hear me okay?
Yes, Pinky, we can hear you.
All right.
What I suggest is you can
Hear
finish
me
this.
now?
Yes, we can hear you now. Can you hear us? Ashley, we can hear you. Can you hear us? Hello? Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
I can now.
Okay, good. Thank you. I think
That's a relief.
let's get started again. Yeah. So Pinky, please continue.
Yeah. All right. We offer a variety of services to entrepreneurs. So it includes advisory and mentoring services. We provide a range of funding support to our startups. And through TechX, we offer tech commercialization support, and we have open access, state-of-the-art scientific facilities, and through our different network events, we offer a lot of networking opportunities to our startups. We have plenty of very unique resource centers that our startups can avail of. And some of them are on the screen. So for example, TechX is the regional tech transfer office at Venture Center and will provide help with licensing and IP services. And I'll be talking a bit more about TechX in the next few slides. And then we also have the Center for Biopharma Analysis, and we have a very unique regulatory information facilitation center that helps entrepreneurs with all regulatory advisory services and their other requirements. So here are some numbers very briefly. So this year, actually, we are celebrating our 15th incorporation day. So it's been 15 years of service to the nation. We have supported close to 600 plus entrepreneurs so far, and almost 90% of our startups are in the early stage, concept, POC, or prototype stage. We have, through our very pioneering lab to market program, taken 10 spin-off companies from CSIR NCL. And we have a highly engaged mentor community of over 200 plus mentors. We are very happy to report that our startups have mobilized almost 500 crore, more than 500 crores in risk capital in the last 6 years, and have generated over 1,000 crores in revenue in the last 5 years. So very briefly about TechX, it is a regional tech transfer office at Venture Center. It is supported by the National Biopharma Mission of BIRAC. TechX aims to support tech commercialization journeys by helping tech developers and tech commercialization entities find each other and make partnerships that will help take the technology closer to market. So these are the various services that TechX offers. So tech marketing, tech transfer, so agreements, deal structuring, spin-off creation, IP support, search and analytics support, and various other support. So please visit our website at techx.in for more details. So now coming to the talk today by Dr. Ashley Stevens, we are very happy to have him talk to us about socially responsible licensing of drugs and vaccines. So very briefly to introduce Dr. Ashley, he has for the last 15 years led Boston University's Office of Tech Transfer. He then became special assistant to the vice president for research for 2 years before retiring from full-time employment at Boston University. For a while, he continued as a lecturer in the Strategy and Innovation Department, where he taught 2 graduate level courses on tech commercialization. Before joining Boston University, he was director of the Office of Tech Transfer at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute at Harvard Medical School. During his tenure at Boston University, the Office of Tech Development has helped spin out over 50 companies based on the university's research, a number of which has managed to raise substantial amounts of capital, and the university's licensing income increased steadily. He is also a guest professor at Osaka University, Japan, where he teaches an intensive summer course on tech commercialization. He has also taught in Chile, China, and India. Prior to entering this profession, Dr. Stevens worked in the biotech industry for nearly 10 years. He was a co-founder of Kytogenics, of which he is still a director, and was co-founder of GenMap and vice president of business development for Biotechnica International. He began his career with the Procter & Gamble company, where he has held a number of positions. And so we are really thrilled to have him here today. And now I would request him to take over.
Thank you. Thank you. So, first of all, I want to thank all the people who've made the Prime program feasible. What I'm going to talk about today is, first of all, let's talk about why it's important, why academic licensing policies can have a significant impact on public health. Then I'll show you why this is important, how public sector research is having a big role in drug discovery. We'll look at the pharmaceutical industry. We'll look at ways that we can encourage affordability of academic discovered drugs in LMICs. And then I'll talk about the evolution of socially responsible licensing. And then we'll talk about what's happened in this area in the pandemic. So I'm going to start out with the story of Zerit and Yale University. AZT is a nucleoside analog discovered as an anti-cancer drug at the Michigan Cancer Center in 1964 by a very productive scientist called Jerome Horowitz. It was unpatented. In 1985, Burroughs Wellcome had the idea of using AZT to prevent HIV replication. They applied for a method of treating patent. And Sam Broder at the National Cancer Institute set up a screen to test for antiretroviral activity, showed AZT was efficacious, and he subsequently showed that several other Horowitz compounds were effective. They were patented by the National Cancer Institute, licensed by NIST, and successfully developed. These were a couple of the first generation anti-cancer, anti-HIV drugs, Videx, DDI, and by Bristol Myers Squibb, and Hivid, DDC by Roche. Then two scientists at Yale discovered that D4T, another nucleoside analog, was effective against HIV/AIDS, and in fact had superior properties. They had funding from NIH and Bristol Myers Squibb, and Yale gave Bristol Myers Squibb an exclusive option to an exclusive license to the results of the research. And Yale filed for a method of treating patent, and this patent was issued in December 1990. And Bristol Myers exercised its option. They signed a license, in fact, before the patent issued in 1988. And the license gave Bristol Myers Squibb the right to determine where to file patents. And they elected the usual places, Europe, Japan, Canada, etc. And they included South Africa, Mexico, and Egypt. Zerit received FDA approval in June 1994. And in 2000, Médecins Sans Frontières compiled a list of essential medicines that the world needed access to, and Zerit was on that list. And MSF started pushing for generic versions of antiretrovirals around this time, and India Cipla offered to supply D4T for 5 cents per tablet. And 39 companies immediately filed suit to prevent MSF from buying generics. They requested a waiver of the South African patent, and Yale said they were powerless. They had already given an exclusive license to Bristol Myers Squibb. Enter Amy Kapczynski. She was a first-year law student at Yale. She'd met Toby at an AIDS conference in Durban the summer before. And Toby had identified that Yale held the key patent and contacted Amy. She supported secured the support of Bill Prusoff and Michael Merson, who was the dean of the Yale School of Public Health and who had formerly headed the World Health Organization's HIV/AIDS program. They got a story in the student newspaper in March. They organized a petition, got 600 signatures, and a week later, the New York Times ran a story about this on the front page of the technology section. There it was. Did not make Yale look good, and I suspect that the trustees of Yale University were most surprised and not pleased when they woke up on this Monday morning to find themselves castigated in this way. So, 3 days later, Bristol Myers Squibb announced it would not enforce the patent in South Africa and offered to sell D4T for 7.5 cents a tablet, 50% more than Cipla. And here was their announcement of that. Eventually, they signed a non-suit with a South African pharmaceutical company, Aspen Pharmaceuticals, which has gone on to become a major drug company, and I believe got bought for a substantial sum by Glaxo. And within a month, a whole bunch of other pharmaceutical companies issued a statement promising to lower costs in LMICs. And the lawsuit was dropped. Amy is now on the faculty of the University of California, Berkeley. So what do we learn from this? Well, doesn't this sound familiar? This could happen at any university today. We routinely give an exclusive option to an exclusive licensee to industrial research sponsors. Our licensees always give the licensee the right to choose where to file patents overseas. In fact, generally, universities won't even file foreign patents without a licensee to reimburse the substantial costs that you might incur. So it's imperative that academic institutions include global health provisions in our licenses when we're licensing healthcare inventions that have relevance to both the developing and the developed world. And I would say that enormous good came from the Zerit case. It really was a landmark case. It may not have felt good to Yale at the time, and it may not feel good in the continuing retellings of the tale. So let's move on now and talk about universities and drug discovery. And here is a paper that I published in the New England Journal of Medicine with some collaborators in 2011. It's probably the highest impact paper I ever published. It is not easy for a PhD to get a paper in the New England Journal of Medicine. And I only made the effort because the dean of my medical school said it will have impact there like nowhere else. And boy, was she right. So in this paper, we did the first analysis of drugs that had received FDA approval that had been had their origins in academic institutions and had been licensed by them to a commercial developer. So this wasn't just the university did some research that was relevant to the drug that maybe a drug company cited in its prior art application on its patents, but this was where the academic institution had got patents and had licensed them to the pharmaceutical sector. And you can see we found 153 drugs, the majority small molecule NCEs, but there were biologics, substantial number of vaccines, one over the counter, and a number of in vivo diagnostics. And then since then, we've been updating the paper and looking at contributions from countries outside the United States. So what we have found is 357 FDA drugs, biologics, vaccines, and in vivo diagnostics. This has not been published. We're working on publishing it, but it is not out there yet. 242 came just from within the US, so that's up from 153 previously. 72 came just from PSRIs outside the US, and 43 had contributions from both within the US and outside the US. This is the breakdown by type of drug. This is the therapeutic categories in which they participate. You'll see oncology, infectious diseases, metabolic diseases, and the central nervous system are the biggest categories. These are the institutions that have discovered the most, and it tends to go along with the size of your research. So the National Institutes of Health in the US has a massive intramural research program, and the University of California, with its 10 campuses, has more research than any other US university. And if you look, a number of these institutions are outside the US. This is the countries where they came from. Excuse me. The US is the leading institution. See if I can get rid of this cough. Emerging economies are relatively unrepresented in this. The Czech Republic is a special circumstance. There's a highly productive collaboration between one of their government laboratories with the Catholic University of Leuven in antivirals. China only has two, both were from military institutes. Russia only one, which is a very old one back in the days of the Soviet Union. And I'm only aware of one case from an emerging economy. That is in India, the National Institute of Immunology, which developed a mycobacterium vaccine to prevent and to treat leprosy as an adjunct to a multi-drug regime. It's only approved in India, and it was licensed to Cadila Pharmaceuticals. So I've established, first of all, that it's important to include global health protections in academic licenses. I've established that public sector research is an important source of new drugs. Now let's look at the pharmaceutical industry. If you look at the traditional pharmaceutical discovery paradigm, we discover our drug and we file a patent application and it starts the clock ticking. And this is generally done by big drug companies. They do the clinical development, starts it probably 3-4 years down the road. And it's probably going to take 9 or 10 years to develop enough clinical information to submit an NDA, for that NDA to be approved and for the drug to be able to start being sold. It's sold at a high price, and these drug companies continue to increase the price as time goes on, although their costs of production don't increase. After 20 years, when the patents have expired, ANDAs can be submitted. This is an application by a generic drug company, which only has to show that their version of this drug is bioequivalent. That means that their version gets to a serum concentration of plus or minus 20% of the brand name drug. Those ANDAs can be approved very quickly, and then we suddenly see that the price drops. There may be a delay, but then a bunch of other drugs, many of whom are in India, enter the market. The price drops, and the price probably continues to go down. So Economics 101 says that monopolies result in high prices, competition results in low prices. In pharmaceuticals, new patent-protected medicines are priced on a market value basis. Older patent expired medicines are priced on a cost plus basis. And the global health challenge is, how do we make new patent protected medicines available in developed countries at cost plus pricing? And how do you develop treatments for diseases that aren't a problem in developed countries? So let's think about how a public sector discovered drug gets to the global market. So our university does its research, gets patents in both the developed world and the non-developed world. And traditionally, we take our patents, we go to our friendly neighborhood drug company, and they develop it in both the developed world and the developing world. How can we modify this process to achieve affordability? In other words, how can we bring that ANDA approval stage 10 years earlier in the process so that the drug is available affordably in the developing world at the same time that it's available at a high price in the developed world? So you could try to change the patent system to achieve this. And a lot of academics are always very enthusiastic to try and do this. Or you could change the licensing system. I would say the problem isn't the patent system. Patents just give you control over what happens to your intellectual property. They're an essential component of the innovation system, and we should be very, very careful about interfering them. It's much easier and less risky to changing licensing behavior. I'll give you an example. The PCT treaty was signed in 1970. It came into effect 8 years later in 1978. 8 years of warning of this change to the patent system globally for companies and universities to adjust. We've seen, by contrast, Bristol Myers Squibb chose in 3 days to change their licensing behavior with respect to their patents in South Africa and allowed generic production of D4T. So are there licensing approaches that we can develop in licensing an academic discovered drug that can do this? And this is a paper that a young woman at Boston University, April Effort, and I, she's now a senior vice president of business development at a biotech company here in Boston, developed and published back in 2008. So some of the mechanisms that we can do is we could include a developing country milestone and pricing. Licensees shall seek registration in a developing country by such and such a date. Licensees shall make the drug available in developing countries at prices no more than 50% of the fully burdened manufacturing cost. We could prohibit patenting in developing countries, allow patenting in developed countries so that they have their protection and their high price to pay for the cost of the research and development there, but no patents in the developing world, and that will allow generic entry immediately. We could have separate licenses. We could say, Merck, you get North America, Europe, and Japan, and Cipla, Ranbaxy, and a whole bunch of other generic companies, you get the developing world. You could specify, Merck, we're going to give you global control, but you must sub-license your rights in the developing world, non-exclusively to multiple, as many generic drug companies as want to take a license. You could say, Merck, you are free to get patents in as many countries as you like, but you may not assert those patents in the developing world. And that would therefore allow our generic companies, and I don't want to plug Cipla and Ranbaxy, but I use those as examples, that would allow them to manufacture and enter developing world markets, and their competition would lower the price of drugs. So that's a number of structures that you can hypothesize that in a licensing context would be relatively easy to implement. You know, you'll come across, there are definitions of developing country. People argue, is it 105, is it 95, whatever, but you know, you can see the point. In many of these developing countries, there is a commercial market for the rich, and we probably want to allow the drug to be sold at prices that they can afford and limit this low price stuff to the public sector, government controlled market. We define that broadly. The sovereign government, agencies like the United Nations, the World Health Organization, World Bank agencies, the Red Cross and Red Crescent, and then the public-private partnerships. I saw in the slides leading up to the start of the webinar that there was a talk being given by the DNDi, Drugs for Neglected Diseases Initiative in Geneva. That's what I mean by a public-private partnership. You have to think about parallel imports. You know, could somebody take this low-priced material in developing countries and take it back into developed countries and sell it at very high prices? And Glaxo, for instance, sold some of its HIV medications in a distinctive trade dress in developing countries, a different color and 3 languages on the pack. So Autumn, the Association of University Technology Managers, got involved with this back in the 2010 timeframe. We created a global health initiative. We had this statement of principles and strategies for the equitable dissemination of medical technologies. And you can see at the time, 10 institutions or more, actually it's more than 10, I think it was about 20 institutions signed on and agreed to do this. I, at the time, was at Boston University. We adopted global health licensing principles in October 2007. Our approach was a non-assert approach. We allowed people to patent wherever they want, but they had to agree not to assert patents in developing countries. We limited it to public sector programs. We allowed them to have a trade dress protection. And this was the language that we used. I won't read it for you, but this was in our standard form of license agreement if we were licensing a healthcare technology. We included global health protections in therapeutics and prophylactics, in diagnostics. We didn't include them in discovery tools or in medical devices. And it's still going strong 14 years later. This is BU standard startup exclusive license, which they have online. So I left BU about 4 years later, 5 years later, and we had gained considerable experience in using the standard provisions. It was pretty simple to include the concept in standard forms of licensing agreement. And then it becomes just another business negotiation. A tough one, I will admit. You've got to include the concept in your negotiations from day one in the term sheet. And it probably took one extra meeting to get the deal done, but we got the deal done. So where does the pharma industry stand? I think they've accepted that they must also help develop drugs for low and middle income countries. That's definitely emerged since around 1999. You know, Novartis has an institute for tropical diseases in Singapore. It's a not-for-profit, has about 200 employees. I haven't updated this. This is from a relatively old talk on this topic. They have an institute for vaccine research in Siena, Italy. And they operate on a no profit, no loss model. We're not going to make a profit on LMICs, but we're not going to lose money either. We will make these drugs and sell them at cost. And frequently they'll hand over development to one of these public-private partnerships. and then they may come back into the picture to help distribute the drugs. And the PPPs can involve local companies, doctors, clinics, etc. And they supply the bulk of the clinical development funding. So here's some examples. Gilead in HIV. Gilead was founded in 1986, and it has multiple AIDS drugs on the market. Viriad, a non-nucleoside reverse transcription inhibitor, Emtreva, another one. And then they've moved on from these to a number of fixed dose combination therapies, Truvada, Atripla, and so on. I have to say that Gilead pioneered the no-profit pricing, the no-profit, no-loss in LMICs by Big Pharma. They were big on licensing Indian generic manufacturers. They did charge a 5% royalty because they felt everybody should contribute to the cost of developing these drugs. Glaxo, also in HIV, they had a cost of production and distribution pricing in developing countries, and they had a voluntary licensing program to 9 generic producers. As I mentioned earlier, they did put their drugs in a distinctive trade dress. I think it was a red dye, and then they had instructions in 3 languages on the package. I'm not sure many other people have continued this distinctive trade dress pattern. It did lead to some regulatory complications. Lilly has drugs for multi-drug resistant TB, 2 antibiotics, and they have been transferring manufacturing expertise to farmers in some of the countries that have been highly impacted by multi-drug resistant TB, South Africa, China, India, Russia. And they have a manufacturing and training facility at Purdue University, and they are supporting multi-drug resistant TB training and awareness programs. So I'm going to go on now and talk about patent pools. In this time frame back in the early aughts, when all this was happening, a lot of thinking went on about how we might streamline the process of getting drugs to LMICs. So patent pools are formed to facilitate access to multiple patents. They have a long and glorious history. The first one was the sewing machine patent pool back in 1856. And there was a very important aircraft patent pool established in 1914. It was actually Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first big public sector achievement negotiating this, because there had been deadlock between the Wright brothers and the Curtiss Aircraft Company over developing aircraft, and aircraft were desperately needed for World War I. More recently, patent pools have been associated with electronic standards, such as the MPEG 2, 3, 4 audio and video pools. And proposals started to be made to form patent pools as a repository for global health rights. Unitaid came up with one, and then a nonprofit called EMILA was proposed. The outcome was the Medicines Patent Pool, an international organization founded and funded by the United Nations agency Unitaid. It was given $4 million in 2010. Its initial focus was on HIV, and then it added TB, malaria, and hepatitis C later in 2015. And drug producers license their patents to the Medicines Patent Pool in defined LMIC territories. And there are currently 22 organizations, mainly companies, but a couple of public sector institutions who have licensed their IP to the Medicines Patent Pool. And then the Medicines Patent Pool sublicenses to generic producers. And they currently have 43 sublicensees. And through December 2020, 19 billion doses of drugs have been administered that have been produced under license from the Medicines Patent Pool. So a very, very substantial achievement. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Medicines Patent Pool when we look at COVID. So let's go on and talk about the pandemic. There was an instant response from academia. On April 7th, 2020, so that's about a month into when we realized we were having a pandemic, Harvard, MIT, and Stanford issued a COVID-19 technology access framework. They pledged to license any COVID-19 related technologies quickly, non-exclusively, and royalty-free for the duration of the pandemic and for a short period thereafter. 20 additional institutions have signed on to that framework. On 10 days later, Autumn, the Association of University Technology Managers, published its COVID-19 licensing guidelines. They were essentially identical to the Harvard, MIT, Stanford framework, and 95 institutions have signed on to these. Some of them are outside the US. So in other words, academia immediately established licensing principles. And these principles were, we talked about how the key to getting affordable medications in developing countries, LMICs, is to have multiple licensees for your patents competing with each other. And so these principles were going to achieve affordability, not just in the developing world, but in the developed world as well, because we were going to license them non-exclusively in all territories. Very important concept. So let's look at some of the specific academic contributions to the pandemic. So my alma mater, the University of Oxford, created an adenovirus-based vaccine, Vaxzevria. It's based on work going back years and years and years, targeting earlier potential pandemics, SARS, MERS, Zika, Ebola, avian flu, etc., that actually finished up not moving from to pandemic levels. They partnered with AstraZeneca to co-develop the technology, and Zeneca agreed to pay. This has been reported by the Wall Street Journal. It's not been officially released by Oxford or AstraZeneca or anybody else, but there's a very detailed Wall Street Journal article you can find that lays out the negotiations and the terms. Oxford's got 10 million upfront and $60 million in milestone payments. There will be a 6% royalty, but it will be royalty-free for the duration of the pandemic. And then AstraZeneca will sell it at zero profit in low and middle income countries in perpetuity. So I think this is just a fantastic socially responsible licensing undertaken by Oxford. Now, Vaxzevria is not approved in the US, but it is the most important vaccine in the developing world. Very importantly, it can be stored in a refrigerator, unlike the RNA virus vaccines, which require deep freezers. It's being manufactured by the Serum Institute of India. It's also been licensed to an Argentine company, Abaxian, who make the active pharmaceutical ingredient, and then Leomont in Mexico formulate it and do finish and fill. And their version has received emergency use authorization from the World Health Organization. Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital came up with a vaccine called Corbevax. It uses old vaccine technology. It's a subunit vaccine. It's old, it's unpatented. They've licensed it multiply to Biological E Limited in India, Bio-Farma in Indonesia, Incepta in Bangladesh, and Immunity Bio in Africa. You can look at the other vaccines. The Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston developed an adenovirus-based vaccine, licensed it to J&J, and that has been a very important vaccine globally. And then, of course, we have the mRNA vaccines. Moderna designed their vaccine jointly with the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in the NIH here in the US, and are involved in a somewhat nasty fight over patents with them. And then both Moderna and the Pfizer-BioNTech mRNA vaccines use lipid nanoparticle delivery technology that originated at the University of British Columbia, although it was subsequently developed in the private sector. And they also use RNA pseudouridine substitution technology developed by Weissman Carrico at the University of Pennsylvania. This was what made mRNA vaccines sufficiently non-immunogenic to be tolerable, to be acceptable medications. And Carrico now works at BioNTech and was instrumental in developing their vaccine. And BioNTech has just announced that they have developed mobile manufacturing units. There are about 3 shipping containers, and that they will supply these for no-profit manufacturing in LMICs. And the first ones are going to go into Rwanda, Senegal, and Ghana. That announcement was made about a week ago. Drugs. Lagevrio is molnupiravir. It was discovered at Emory University. Emory has been an antiviral drug discovery powerhouse. You saw how high up it came on that list of institutions I showed you that have discovered drugs that have got FDA approval. That's because they've discovered 2 or 3 HIV actives, and then these have been used in multiple fixed-dose combination therapies. They licensed it to Drive LLC, and I saw that Drive is going to be giving a webinar to TechX. Drive is a wholly owned drug development LLC, wholly owned by Emory. They got the drug into phase 1, and I should say that Drive LLC has been funded by Emory's profits from its HIV medications. Drive, after getting it into phase 1, licensed it to Ridgeback Therapeutics, who got it into phase 2, and immediately were able to take that stage to get into a partnership with Merck, who got FDA approval about 6 months ago. Well, not approval, emergency use authorization. And Emory, Ridgeback, and Merck have licensed molnupiravir to the Medicines Patent Pool for low and middle income countries, royalty-free for the duration of the pandemic, and they already have 30 sub-licensees already. I should also mention that Pfizer, which has the other oral small molecule drug that is effective against COVID, has also, Paxlovid, has also licensed it to the Medicines Patent Pool for LMICs. Academic institutions have been active in diagnostics. University of California, Berkeley, which I should mention was a pioneer in socially responsible licensing policies. You will remember them, of course, as the co-discoverer of CRISPR, for which Jennifer Doudna and Michel Carpentier, who was at a Swedish university when she made her contribution, got the Nobel Prize this year. They set up a company called CRISPR to develop CRISPR technology based on Cas9. And then Berkeley, Doudna went on and discovered Cas12 and other implementations of CRISPR. And they licensed Cas12 to Mammoth Bio, including global health protections. And Mammoth Bio developed rapid diagnostic detector boost. which is competitive with PCR. They partnered it with Agilent to improve the speed of the test, and with GlaxoSmithKline to develop an over-the-counter version of the test. Yale and the National Basketball Association developed a saliva direct COVID test, so an easier sampling methodology than having to swab your nose. And they have authorized dozens of labs across the US. McGill University in Canada observed that all the Canadian PCR tests were imported as kits. And so, Canada was vulnerable to supply chain disruptions and to having their access to testing cut off. And so they developed a all Canada sourced PCR test and showed that it was equivalent in performance to the imported tests, and it has received an emergency use authorization. And you even saw academic institutions entering the COVID supply chain. Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia started testing personal protective equipment imports into Canada because there were concerns about counterfeit, defective goods in the early days. Columbia University in the US designed face masks for 3D printing. They first turned over their own 3D printing machines to make them, and then they added contract manufacturers, and millions of these have been manufactured. University of Calgary started manufacturing ventilators and has put hundreds of these into service. So that's a rather quick trip through a big and complex topic. Here's a book that was written or edited by Anatol Kratinger, who was at MIR at the time, which was a non-profit in the UK. MIR's gone out of business, but this 2-volume, very large volume collection of articles on all sorts of aspects of intellectual property management in health and agriculture is still available online. So with that, thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ashley. I think that was a lot of very interesting information, including the ones you have compiled for COVID as well. I didn't know several of them. So some of these, of course, we've been following as well. So I think
the reason for those, Premnath, is I'm sorry, I don't know where I got this cough. About 3 weeks ago, I got an email from the Journal of Healthcare Policy saying they were publishing an article with a title of something like Academic Licensing Abandons Global Health Concerns in the Pandemic Response. And they invited me to write an article responding to this. Well, when I read their article, it was 3 Canadian academics, 2 law professors and a clinical professor of medicine. And they were castigating the University of British Columbia for not including global health protections in liquid nanoparticle technology that's used by, as I said, by Pfizer and Moderna. And from that, they extrapolated to all academic institutions in the world. It made my blood boil. It was such a bad article. First of all, the only license from the University of British Columbia in this space was done in July 1998. The patents are expired. Moderna and Pfizer vaccines are not royalty bearing to UBC. The last amendment to the license was done in 2007. So this was just when we were working out how to do global health protections. All the subsequent technology development was done in companies. So I wanted to find examples of, because I had seen how academic institutions were responding to the pandemic so forcefully. And so I'd actually been thinking of writing an article about this. So here I was given my opportunity with a guaranteed publication So I jumped on it. Various colleagues in the academic profession have been very helpful in coming up with these examples, and I got lots of input to make sure that what I presented today was accurate.
Thank you. I will be taking up questions from the audience as well. So please feel free to put out your questions on the chat box. And if you want to ask the question yourself, you can just raise your hand, use the raise hand button as well. Let me just start by requesting you to comment on, the data which you showed, where I think the top 3 on your list was NIH, University of California, and Emory, and probably UC and Emory, all of them probably also receive a lot of government support to make those molecules possible, right? So would you want to comment on what makes, first of all, the US such a powerhouse for new drug development research? I mean, we didn't see as many cases from Europe in your list, right? I would have thought Europe should also have been on the list, but doesn't look like. So can you tell us what are the kind of things that happen? And the second point I wanted to request you to speak on is NIH. When it's such a producer of so many new drugs, what are the provisions in their agreements which allow today provisions to take care of interests in the developing world?
So first, let's talk about Europe. There are a number of European countries that are on the list. I think the UK has been productive. Germany shows up quite strongly, but that's rather a special case. There's a research institute in Jena that discovered DPP4 technology that is used in a lot of type 2 diabetes drugs. And it was licensed non-exclusively for multiple drugs. So they're rather a special case. Belgium and Czechoslovakia show up well, but that's because of this collaboration between one of the national laboratories in Czechoslovakia and the Catholic University of Leuven. There are countries that, France has got a few, but people like Spain, Italy, the Scandinavian countries don't show up. Sweden, there are a few, but they were out of the Karolinska Institute. So I think Europe is up there to a reasonable extent. Canada has been very effective, although the University of Toronto was a co-inventor of this DPP4 technology with East Germany that I mentioned. And then you asked me something about...
yeah, so what are the enabling of, other than funding and financing, are there other things which are making it possible to be more active in drug development in the US?
Well, I want to correct you there, Premnath, because it's rather a sensitive subject.
Okay.
There's not a lot of government funding, absent the pandemic. I'll talk separately about the pandemic, but there's not a lot of government funding for development of drugs in the public sector. There's a lot of public sector funding for research, but by and large, the development is done by the private sector and is paid for. There's rather an interesting example that's in a big political discussion right now. And this is the cancer drug Xtandi, discovered by the University of California, Los Angeles, and licensed to a company called Medivation, which licensed it to Astellas, and which then got bought by Pfizer. There's been some big lawsuits that I worked on, so I've done a lot of research in this area. And I've been able to calculate both the discovery cost at UCLA and the development cost at Medivation and Astellas. And the discovery cost was about $3 million, roughly. The development cost was $2 billion. So the public sector contribution was like 0.1%. So discovery in the public sector, development in the private sector.
Mhm. Okay. I think that probably also, I mean, overall, it shows up as about 60–70% of the R&D spending happening in the private sector in the US, I suppose. But I think in a given case, it might be much larger in terms of the amount of money spent in development. You're just saying it's only 0.1%, right? Which is very, very small.
In the case of Xtandi, 0.1% was discovery and 99.9% was development.
Yeah. So in things like NIH's funding, for example, what are the kind of terms which would ensure today that drugs are available in the developing world and in the interest of public health, global public health? And maybe you can take the example of Moderna, that if the lawsuit turns in the direction of NIH, what would be the consequence?
NIH was a pioneer in including global health protections in their licenses. As I sit here today, I couldn't tell you what their standard provisions are, but I'm very close friends with Mark Rohrback, who was director of the Central Office of Technology Transfer at the NIH for many years and is now a senior policy advisor. I'll be happy to reach out to him and say, okay, what particular mechanism, if one, I mean, they may use multiple mechanisms, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I said, by and large, research in the public sector, development in the private sector. In COVID, that wasn't true. The government stepped in with massive funding, even to Pfizer and big companies, as well as Moderna, which at the time was a big biotech, but not on the scale of the big drug companies. And they paid for their clinical development, and then they made massive advanced purchase commitments so that these companies could justify building production facilities. There was just a mammoth, very successful government program. It's called Operation Warp Speed. That might have been an unfortunate title, because I think it made people think in the public that this was all rushed and that these vaccines were risky, whereas in fact, as I said, they have been, the underlying mechanisms have been developed over 20 years, going back to SARS and MERS and potential pandemics like that.
Okay. Vinay, do you want to ask your question, please? Shall I? Vinay Mehta?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's a little weak, but please a little louder. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Okay.
Little louder.
I wanted to know that, could there be some inter-university, kind of licensing instead of just to the industry? Like many universities across the world are working on the same problem, right? And let's say one university in developed country, because of the environment and all those facilities and all those things, they get a breakthrough first, right? And now, in case of, let's say, pandemic or emergency situation, can that university also talk to the institution in the developing country to transfer the technology to them? Or I mean, could this arrangement be also envisaged as one of the arrangements or not?
Could you hear that, Ashley?
So I think he's asking, why don't universities license to other universities? Perhaps like universities in the developed world license to universities in the developing world.
Yeah,
Um,
maybe I can also state it slightly differently that if there are multiple universities working on the same topic, are there such collaborative efforts which result in local universities, I mean, licensing locally because of the collaboration? Yeah, go ahead,
Yeah,
please.
yeah.
um, part of the problem in getting from the university, getting the drug into development, is that after the discovery stage, the research stage, a lot of the stuff is kind of, quote, boring. You've shown it works in a mouse, now you need to show it works in a rabbit, then in a dog, then in something bigger and so forth. You need to do toxicology. These are the sorts of things that grant review committees don't consider innovative science. So it's very hard for universities to get the funding to do this. Not many universities have the sort of good laboratory practices and good manufacturing practices, facilities that are necessary to make drugs in quantities to start to do clinical testing and toxicology. So that's why, generally speaking, universities want to get their drugs into the hands of the private sector as soon as they can, because those are the people who have these things. Now, I mentioned this Drive LLC at Emory. That is a nonprofit organization that does have these capabilities and just focuses on drug discovery. But as I said, the money that funds them don't come from the government, I don't believe, but it came from Emory's profits from its royalties on its HIV medications. So it was kind of recycling those profits from drug discovery back into further drug discovery.
Ashley, I would like you to comment a little bit on open source drug discovery. And are there any instances where it has worked well, where it has been done in a model which is a little more open for people to access it and utilize the information that is generated? And what are your thoughts on those? Does it work? Will it work? What are the issues? Where will it falter?
Well, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the concepts of open science and open discovery. People think it means, oh, you don't need patents. But that's not true. You do. You have to have intellectual property to transfer. So I think some of the best examples in the drug discovery world are what I call these PPPs, the public-private partnerships, of which people like DNDi, PATH in Seattle, the TB Alliance, people like this. These are essentially not-for-profit drug companies. The traditional corporate drug companies, they discover or license drugs, they pay for the development, they sell them at high prices, and they take those profits and put them back into the next cycle of developing the next round of drugs. What the nonprofit drug companies do is they get their funding to do the discovery and development from philanthropies, from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Wellcome Trust, from governments, things like this. So that allows them to then take the drugs they discover and develop and sell them at low prices. But when you look at these PPPs, they all have to license in the original discoveries. And then they develop them and then license them out to multiple generic companies that will manufacture them and sell them at low prices.
Can you tell us a little bit more about how models such as MMV or even Carbex work at the back end in terms of how do they enable access and affordability?
So Carbex, which is Combating Antibiotic Resistant Bacteria Accelerator. This is a program that I actually work with. It's a $550 million program over 5 years. It's funded by BARDA, the Biologic Research and Development Agency. I forget what it stands for, BARDA, but that's part of the Department of Defense in the US and the Wellcome Trust in the UK. And it brought in the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the German, the British governments, and so forth. And it puts money into discovering treatments and preventatives and tests for antibiotic resistant bacteria. It will pay to take those drugs and tests as far as phase 1 testing, no further. The initial 5 years is up, and it is seeking refunding. And I have not heard from Dr. Outerson, who runs it, how he's doing that. Amazingly, this is run out of not Boston University's School of Medicine, but out of Boston University's School of Law. Professor Outerson is the head of the healthcare law program, and he was a pioneer in thinking about antibiotics. If you think about antibiotics, are a very special type of drug. Most drugs, if they're safe and effective, you want them used as broadly as possible. Antibiotics aren't like that because the bugs adapt to resist the bacteria, the antibiotics. And so you want them used very sparingly and only in cases where they're absolutely necessary. And that means you have particular market challenges. And, in the last 5 years, 3 biotech companies that successfully developed antibiotics to treat resistant bacteria went bankrupt because there was just no market for the drugs. And Professor Outerson had done a lot of research and thinking on the policy aspects of antibiotic markets. And that's how he was selected by BARDA and the Wellcome Trust to run this program. There is a pool of money available from pharmaceutical companies to do phase 2 testing of these drugs once they've successfully come out of phase 1 testing funded by Carbex. Carbex really wants to pay to take existing discoveries and show that they have, to do the proof of principle work, to do the toxicology and get them into phase 1 testing. Most of what they get comes in from small companies. They've funded 3 or 4 big companies. They have funded some universities, but by and large, I would say most of the examples are the universities licensed to a small biotech, which is doing the initial development, and they have been the contractees with Carbex. Carbex has a very good website. You can go on it. You can look at the projects they've funded. You can look at them regionally. I know there have been 3 small companies in India, I think a couple out of NCL, that have received funding from Carbex.
Can you tell us
I think the challenge in the emerging world is that it's tough to find risk capital. If a university licenses a drug to a startup company, for that startup company to get risk capital is tough. What you're seeing actually first in the UK and then spreading to the US is venture funds, substantial venture funds linked to universities. Now, Oxford University has the largest venture fund in the world linked to a university, 600 million pounds they have raised. But there are starting to be significant university-linked venture funds in the US that can provide this early capital.
Yeah, are there any specific restrictions on pricing or on licensing, more in terms of licensing terms for developing countries in, say, the CARB-X model or the MMV model?
I don't believe so. You know, universities find it tough to license their inventions. We only license about 25% of the invention disclosures we get. We only file patents on about half of the invention disclosures we get. So we only license about half of the patents we file. And you don't want to do anything that makes it more difficult to license them. The NIH used to have a reasonable pricing clause in its cooperative research and development agreements. These are agreements in which a company collaborates with NIH on developing a discovery NIH has made. And in return for the collaboration and putting money and effort into developing it, the company can get a exclusive license to the NIH underlying IP. And there were concerns about, you know, high-priced drugs coming from this. So they had a reasonable pricing clause. It acted as a deterrent to companies to license and do creators with NIH. And when NIH removed the constraint in about 1995, as I recall, the number of creators that companies wanted to enter into with them immediately grew enormously. And so this clause was taken out. It had never been used. Nobody knew what it meant. What is a reasonable price for a drug? And certainly a research agency like NIH has felt that they would be very poor judge of what was a reasonable price. And so it's gone away. As I said, we have these mechanisms of encouraging multiple licensees in developing countries, and those have proven feasible, realistic clauses to include in licenses. But I'm a big proponent of this being done on a voluntary basis, not a mandatory basis. India and South Africa, at the start of the pandemic, proposed to the World Trade Organization that there be a waiver on COVID drug patents and vaccines under the TRIPS agreement. That was opposed by the developed countries. It's still being discussed at the World Trade Organization. It's got nowhere. And yet, as I said, BioNTech has just announced we're going to supply mobile manufacturing facilities for at-cost production in developing countries. That's an overnight decision on the business side that can be taken very quickly, whereas the trying to modify the patent system, as I've said, is very difficult.
I think we have had a lot of questions. Just last question from the audience, and then we can close probably. Pinky, is that okay?
Yes, sir. Yeah.
Yeah. So Shankar Rao, you can, if you want.
He had raised his hand.
Sorry.
Yeah. Very, very good morning, Professor. Excellent talk.
Go ahead, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah. So during 90s, when the AIDS prevalent, volunteer licensing was the new norm, and it worked. Maybe in the COVID time, this IP waiver and open source, open innovation is the prevalent time. So when compared with 1990s and now in 2020, so what is the remarkable changes in the licensing terms, and licensing strategies take place then and now?
Ashley, could you understand that question?
Not very well. Can you perhaps rephrase it for me, Premnath?
Yeah, I think the question was primarily asking you to comment on what has changed between, say, what happened during the AIDS, AIDS epidemic during, say, in South Africa in the 90s, and now during COVID. At that time, probably voluntary licensing was the norm. I mean, that's what Shankar Rao said. Whereas now it seems to be more open innovation. Well, I don't necessarily agree with that, but that's what I think he mentioned. Do you want to comment on whether there's anything that has changed between those two times?
Yeah, see what happened in AIDS was that up till then, the diseases of the developing world, the infectious diseases, were old diseases. There were established treatments that were out of patent and were available cheap in everywhere. You know, antibiotics are cheap in the developed world and in the developing world. But then along came AIDS, which was a new disease. And suddenly we got these new treatments that were still patent protected and expensive. And that was the initial shock. And it was profoundly shocking that 39 companies sued to stop Cipla supplying cheap D4T to South Africa. But the weight of public opinion very quickly changed, and you saw how quickly Bristol Myers Squibb changed from suing to stop Cipla supplying cheap D4T to saying, we'll make it available cheap ourselves. And that realization spread through the pharmaceutical industry. And I think there's now a realization that there's, 100 poor countries in the world that cannot afford expensive drugs, and we have to do better. So I think the mechanisms have been established. I think in the pandemic, you're seeing big companies take innovations and say, we understand that this has to be affordable in the developed world. I think a good system has been arrived at. I think looking at Molnupiravir from Emory, that's gone through a great pathway. The fact that Emory, from its earlier HIV work, has the funds to set up DRIVE, which can take Molnupiravir, which was actually developed several years ago as an influenza treatment. And they very quickly realized that it might have potential against COVID and tested it and found that indeed it did. But the fact that they had the funds to swiftly take this into preclinical testing, do the toxicology, be able to file an IND and start phase 1 testing, and then give it to Ridgeback, and then Ridgeback gets it into phase 2, and then into Merck. What a great system we've developed and how fast this was done. The world has come a long way in 20 years in both the capabilities of academic institutions and the realization of what is the right thing to do.
Ashley, the last question, and then we can close. Thank you for taking all these questions. You must have noticed that the list of essential medicines is now increasingly seeing a lot of biologics in it. And as that happens, the old world methods of bringing in generics for small molecules is, it was relatively easier. Bringing in generics for biologics is a lot more difficult. Do you think would you like to suggest ways by which probably at least the essential medicines could be available a little more equitably and affordably in the developing world?
Yeah, I mean, in the US, after a lot of effort, we have bioequivalent legislation that allows equivalence of biological molecules. But whereas in the small molecule space, when the drug goes generic, the price drops by 95% within a year. In the biological space, my understanding is that prices have come down by maybe a third, because you have to do your own clinical testing. Because biological molecules are so sensitive to the production process compared with the easily identified chemical standards of small molecules, the costs of making a generic biological are much higher than the costs of developing a small molecule generic. So there are going to be ongoing costs. I don't think we'll see them as cheaply. I gotta say, one of the molecules that I think is an absolute scandal is insulin. We've had biotech insulin available since the late 1980s. Insulin is unglycosylated, so it's easy to make, easy to compare between people, and yet the price is astronomical in the US to this day. There are people who just can't afford it, who haven't got insurance, and they take half doses to stretch it out and they die. And why insulin is as high priced as it is, I've never understood. I know we've had new chemical modifications, fast acting, slow acting, and then taking combination of fast and a slow and so forth. But insulin really should be a lot cheaper than it is today.
Okay, so I think thank you very much. This is something which will be an ongoing discussion, and I think there's a big role for public sector to play in this activity. Of course, we are all exploring ways by which we can be more useful in public health, and this talk definitely provides some food for thought. So with that, I think we can close. Pinky, over to you. Thank you very much, Ashley, for this very useful and insightful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be closing the event, but before that, can I request all of you to turn on your videos so that we can take a quick, yeah.
Pinky, you should have done it earlier.
Yeah, we're down to 27 people left.
Sorry about that.
Can you see some more videos? Pictures?
Can't wait, I'll just check. Okay, it's not, yeah, I'll just allow people to turn on their cameras. Wait.
Oh, sorry. How about now? Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you to all of you for joining in. And this is something which I think we will have many more occasions to discuss in the near future. We are running a few more events coming up. One is by Drive, another by DNDi, with DNDi. And if all goes well, we'll try and run something with Pfizer as well. So, are you done, Pinky?
Yeah, I'm done.
Yeah, so please join us in that meeting as well. So thank you very much. Do give your feedback and the link that Pinky has provided. Pinky, over to you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ashley.
Thank you.